Good afternoon. Welcome to today's presentation by Tom Schmutz, CEO of FLYHT Aerospace, and Alana Forbes, CFO, also joined by Paul Gill, who will be doing a demo of the software. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for the latest of Adelaide Capital's Investor Update webinar series. Previous webinars can be found on the Adelaide Capital website or YouTube channel, where this one will also be posted in a few days. A few things before we get started. First, I would like to make everyone aware that this presentation will contain forward-looking statements. If you're unfamiliar with forward-looking statements, I encourage you to read the disclosure contained in the company's corporate presentation. The presentation can be found on the company's website and was recently updated for today's overview. Questions can be typed in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and throughout the presentation, but will not be answered until the end of the session. You can also email your questions to info@adcap.ca or deborah@adcap.ca. And now with those few items out of the way, I'd like to turn the mic over to Tom Schmutz, who's going to tell you about FLYHT Aerospace.
Good morning, everybody. Let me share the presentation. So welcome to this presentation post first quarter for FLYHT. For FLYHT, our products provide our customers the ability to understand not only where their aircraft are, but how they are. Our solutions save aircraft operators money. It streamlines their operations and enhances their operational safety, which can prevent accidents and save lives. A few KPIs and the big story in FLYHT. At the end of the first quarter, we finished with $52 million in sales order backlog. These are sales orders and contracts which have been executed with our customers but not yet delivered. So that speaks to revenue potential in the future as we're able to ship out that backlog. We finished the year 2019 with slightly over $21 million in revenue, which was a significant increase over the previous year, 2018. We continue to see strong regulatory tailwinds that we think will enhance and improve our ability to grow in the future, and I'll cover those in the next couple slides. Our core business is software as a service. We currently generate approximately 70% gross margins on that core business through the software products that we sell. Those software products generated 48% of our 2019 revenues from SaaS. And as I mentioned in the conference call, that was the largest percentage of SaaS revenues as a percentage of overall revenues since 2012. Slide 4 shows the context diagram of how our systems work. You can see inside of the diagram on the left-hand side, we integrate our AFIRS product and the TAMDAR product into commercial aviation, into the aircraft. The AFIRS product integrates into the electronics bay, and the TAMDAR integrates into the fuselage. The data from both the TAMDAR and from AFIRS is broadcast over the Iridium satellite constellation, down through the gateway, and ultimately to our terrestrial-based technology, which is the Uptime Cloud User Interface. It's on this Cloud User Interface where we create the software as a service products, and we sell those products a la carte to our customers, who are aircraft operators and lessors. The items that have been driving FLYHT in the business are shown here on slide 5. Now, this does not take into account some of the changes that have impacted the industry since the COVID-19 pandemic has occurred, but we will discuss how FLYHT is dealing with some of those challenges later in the presentation when Alana Forbes discusses the financial aspects of the company. In general, commercial aircraft has been growing at a rate of 5% annually and is expected to do so into the future, which means over a period of 20 years, we'll see a doubling of the fleet worldwide. Particular areas of growth are in China, India, Asia Pacific regions, and Eurasia. China has been growing the most rapidly in all of these areas. And by 2037, they're expected to have upwards of 450 airports, which is a large number of airports. Within the growing commercial aircraft industry is the use of satellite. So satellite is relatively new in the scheme of things in aviation. It's been used commonly for transoceanic flights where there's a lack of good communications means. But the growth in the use of satellite has been expanding far beyond that because of its lightweight and useful nature. And finally, as we move forward, FLYHT finds itself in a very excellent position in the middle of this connected aircraft opportunity. So more and more events that occur on aircraft are connected in real time back to Aircraft Operations Center and into air traffic control. This is being enabled by satellite systems and other high bandwidth systems that move data to and from aircraft. And the SaaS services that FLYHT offers provide a means of connecting and providing real-time insight into what's happening on board the aircraft. In parallel with this, these industry drivers, which we feel are creating opportunity for companies like FLYHT in this industry, are the regulatory changes that have been occurring. And you see that in the lower right-hand side of the slide. At the end of last year, there was a deadline in China for real-time communication with an aircraft. The Aircraft Operations Center needed to be able to communicate with airlines operating in China within 4 minutes. The way to overcome this, since the primary means of communicating with an aircraft is still very high frequency. Very high frequency is a communication system that's enabled by terrestrial-based equipment. So they have towers, similar to cell towers for cellular service. VHF has towers that allow ground-to-air communications. China has a good build-out of this VHF infrastructure in their coastal regions, but in the vast interior of China and other third world countries, they don't have that infrastructure. It hasn't been built. So rather than investing in that infrastructure, the Chinese government has wisely required their operators to move towards satellite. That allows them to essentially leapfrog over the building of that infrastructure and still have a reliable means of communicating with the aircraft. So while the deadline was at the end of last year, not all of the airlines have complied. It is an odd situation in China because so many of the airlines are government owned. So there's been negotiations back and forth between the regulatory bodies and the airlines. So we do expect that there will be compliance over the next couple of years. And we believe that FLYHT is extremely well positioned in China to continue to earn the business of airlines. We've won 23 of the 57 operators there now, and we expect to win more as time goes forward. Outside of China, there's the primary regulatory changes have come as a result of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization's requirements following the Air France 447 and the Malaysian Air tragedies. Those came out in Amendment 40 of Annex 6, the operation of an aircraft. And Amendment 40 required autonomous distress tracking in 2021, which has been delayed to 2023 now, which requires an aircraft in distress to issue its position in 1-minute intervals. And for new airframe types after 2021, they will have to access their flight data in a timely manner. FLYHT believes that we have the opportunity to grow through these mandates with our patented triggered streaming of flight data over satellite. So currently, FLYHT owns this patent in the United States, Canada, and China, and it's pending elsewhere. This patent protects FLYHT's right to, in a triggered manner, stream data from the flight recorder over satellite to a ground-based collection point. And therefore, if there's an accident or an incident then the operator and the accident investigator can begin the investigation immediately rather than having to wait until they recover the black box. So those are some of the regulatory items that we feel have driven and will continue to drive FLYHT's growth. Slide 6 shows the core products that FLYHT sells. On the left-hand side is where we typically see competition with other satellite communication providers in the industry. And to the right are the products that we upsell once we have installed our equipment on board an aircraft. Where we compete is in basic SATCOM. So this is giving an aircraft a phone number. We call that FLYHT voice. Being able to send text messages to that aircraft, we call that FLYHT mail. And then also sending these teletype messages over the satellite communication. These teletype messages are sent between air traffic control and the aircraft, and also the aircraft operations center. ACARS traffic has been around for quite some time, since the late 80s. And we provide the ability to transport that data over Iridium, as do others. Once our equipment is installed, FLYHT uniquely sells these real-time software as a service products in an a la carte manner. So working from the left-hand side, our first group of products enable enhanced global flight tracking. These products are called FLYHT Log, FLYHT ASD, and AirMap. FLYHT Log is a collection of the flight times, the out, off, on, in times, which determine crew pay and maintenance intervals for the aircraft. Also gives you a basic understanding of the status and location of your aircraft. The aircraft situational display, or FLYHT ASD, and AirMap are situational displays that graphically show where the aircraft is, what's happening, or if there's anything abnormal on board the aircraft. Also shows weather capabilities based on our TAMDAR, which is our weather sensor that's collected. Paul Gill is going to show a demonstration of those functions in just a bit. The next set of products is called Aircraft Health Monitoring. This is a product that we call FLYHTHealth, and composed of engine trending. So we collect automatically and send to aircraft engine manufacturers and third-party evaluators the data that's necessary to evaluate engines and maintain warranty requirements for those engines. We monitor exceedances, which are out-of-bounds conditions for the airframe and for the instrumentation inside the aircraft, the avionics. And finally, we have the ability to provide diagnostics, or the ability to log into an aircraft while it's flying and evaluate what's happening on board the aircraft. And I'll show that, an example of that, when I show you what we did for Boeing during the eco demonstrator. The third box in the a la carte menu is FLYHT Stream. This is our patented streaming of the FLYHT data recorder. We can stream the essential parameters from the FLYHT data recorder over a satellite, over Iridium. Currently, we have customers that use that capability. We can also stream a much broader set over wider pipes, and we demonstrated that during the Boeing eco demonstrator trial. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Fuel management, we offer a training program called FLYHT Fuel. What FLYHT Fuel does is it monitors 8 different fuel saving operations on board an aircraft. There's different behaviors that the pilot and crew can perform during the operation of an aircraft to save fuel. And fuel is represents about 35% of the operating expenses for an airline. So changing the behavior of pilots and crews can dramatically impact the bottom line. This includes items like monitoring whether or not on taxi out and taxi in, the crew turns off an engine, how quickly an aircraft will hook up to airport power and avoid using the auxiliary power unit in the tail of the aircraft, how and when the crew deploy the flaps on takeoff and landing. All of these have impacts on the fuel use of the aircraft. All of these can be determined by the aircraft operator on SOPs and how they're used. And flight fuel allows the airline to measure the performance of their crews and pilots against these objectives. Finally, the last element that we include in our software as a service is weather observations collected by our dedicated sensor, TAMDAR. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. This is the aircraft situational display called AirMap, and I'm going to skip over this because Paul is going to go through it in detail. Just to give you a little bit more detail on FLYHTHealth, which is one of our products that I just described. We have a customer that has a fleet of 50 of one type of aircraft, and they have found that if they can improve their on-time performance by 1%, they can save about $500,000 a year in operations for just 1%. So this chart shows the value and the value proposition represented by FLYHTHealth. In this particular picture, it shows for a particular aircraft type, if you Pareto the things that typically go wrong with that aircraft, just like if you have a 78 Chevy, certain things break on that vehicle. For certain aircraft types, the same things tend to go wrong. So when those things get Paretoed, those are the elements that typically will interfere with the on-time performance of an aircraft. Weather delays are the number one hindrance to on-time performance. The second largest impact on on-time performance is unscheduled maintenance. So all of these elements represent things that can go wrong with a particular aircraft type. And if we can gather more data on these particular elements and provide that to our aircraft operators in a timely manner, that allows them to move elements from unscheduled maintenance to scheduled maintenance. And that is the fundamental value proposition that FLYHTHealth offers. This slide 9 shows 3 different value propositions from success stories that FLYHT has provided in the past. The first area represents disaster avoidance. We have a fleet operator in the United States that bought some used aircraft, 767s. They installed AFIRS into those products, purchased and operated FLYHTHealth, and began monitoring those aircraft in operation. It turned out that one of those aircraft began exhibiting high engine vibrations. They were able to pull that aircraft out of service, reevaluate it. They found a cracked turbofan in the hot section of the engine. The cost for replacing that engine was about $780,000, but the cost if that engine had deteriorated further would have been $5.2 million, and the potential safety factor of that engine deteriorating while in operation could potentially have saved lives. The second class is reduction in maintenance costs. So aircraft are required to enroll in certain types of maintenance programs. If they have Rolls-Royce engines, then they have to change out their fan blades depending upon the type of program that they use to report on the usage of those fan blades. FLYHT has a dedicated program within our FLYHTHealth program where we automatically report on fan blade usage and time. And it's done in such a way that the operator that uses our program to report this can avoid having to change out fan blades for longer periods of time. And the savings for this allows them to go an additional 2 years with the in-service engine without having to take it out of service to replace this, which is a very costly endeavor. The third scenario deals with lease penalty avoidances. And a typical lease avoidance is a lease may require an operator to perform a certain number of takeoffs at reduced thrust. So if you're an operator around the world and you have aircraft distributed elsewhere, how do you go about making sure that your operators are going to meet this 10% reduced thrust takeoff around the world? You need a mechanism of collecting that data real time into a centralized location to allow you to make those evaluations and modify the behavior of operators. So we can do this within FLYHTHealth and save hundreds of thousands of dollars in lease penalties. This slide shows the addressable market. So currently the total addressable market around the world, business jets and commercial aviation, is roughly 40,000 aircraft. Our core market is commercial aviation with about 25,000 aircraft. We have shipped 2,800 units, and of those units, roughly 600 are providing software as a service. Out of those 600 units, we were able to generate over $10 million in software as a service. So what this intends to show is that while we have shipped about 10% of the core addressable market, which is commercial aviation, there's still a significant amount of that market that we can address. And within our ships market, there's a great deal of opportunity to grow on SaaS, which is our core business. At the end of last year, we were able to announce a very exciting contract win with WestJet. We announced a $6.2 million contract to install our AFIRS product on their entire fleet of Boeing 737 aircraft. It's expected that this fleet will total in excess of 160 aircraft. This is a hardware sale initially, so that will go inside of our hardware category. The hardware does enable certain capabilities that WestJet was looking for, which is air traffic control data safety services, voice safety services, as well as generalized voice. We do anticipate, along with this installation, to be able to continue to show WestJet the capabilities that we can enhance and provide in their operations with software as a service. And so that work is ahead of us. The WestJet, along with the rest of the industry, have recently hit some challenging operational changes with the impact of the COVID virus, and they have slowed down operations. We were due to begin installation in WestJet in the middle of the year. That's likely pushed out later, but all indications are right now is that we will move forward with this installation. It's a required upgrade that they have as part of their internal requirements, and we're excited to get started. I mentioned earlier the TAMDAR sensor. This is the sensor installed on an AirAsia aircraft. We have roughly 250 of these sensors installed on aircraft around the world. TAMDAR stands for Tropospheric Airborne Meteorological Data Reporting. This sensor collects data like a weather balloon does. So you can see the types of data that it collects: speed, wind speed, temperature, relative humidity. These are very typically collected by weather balloons. In addition, it collects things like icing and turbulence. This data is sent in real time over satellite, and it's used by meteorological agencies to augment numerical weather prediction. So every time an aircraft that's equipped with one of our TAMDAR sensors takes off and lands, it's the equivalent of the weather researchers launching a weather balloon and collecting that data. This chart 13 shows the impact of that data. So on the right-hand side, you can see the radar of an actual weather event that occurred over the Virginia and the Carolinas. This weather event was measured by weather radar, so that's an actual event. If you back up to the left 72 hours, you can see the numerical weather prediction that predicted that weather event. And you can see it on the bottom without the TAMDAR data included in the model. And you can see it on the top with the TAMDAR data included in the model. So by sampling the atmosphere and then injecting those samplings into the numerical weather prediction, you can dramatically improve the model. And so you can see that the TAMDAR enhanced model is much more accurate compared to the actual weather event than that without TAMDAR. Right about 2 years ago, we performed a eco-demonstrator trial with Boeing. I mentioned earlier the timely access to flight data requirement that's coming forth after 2021 for new aircraft types. Boeing wanted to evaluate our technology as a means of satisfying that requirement. On the left-hand side, you can see the FedEx aircraft that was leased back from FedEx and filled with about 37 different experiments. They experimented with things like biofuels, low-cost metallic structures, lasers that measured clear air turbulence, so a variety of different forward-looking technologies. For this timely access to flight recorder data, they chose FLYHT and only FLYHT, installed us on the aircraft, and evaluated our ability to meet the requirements outlined by ICAO. You can see in the center, in the white paper that was delivered jointly by FLYHT, Boeing, and Embraer, that the determination was that our equipment met the requirements and that we were able to, using streaming technology, to meet the requirements over satellite to meet the ICAO objectives. This page showed what we demonstrated to Boeing and Embraer. So our AFIRS equipment was installed on the aircraft in the electronics bay. What you see on the left-hand side is an animation that you would look at on the ground inside of our Uptime Enterprise server. So you would log in. When you logged in, this is what you would see. You would see the animation of the aircraft. We're streaming all of the aircraft attitude information along with all of the data from the flight data recorder over both Inmarsat and over Iridium during this particular trial. So as it's streaming, you can see the aircraft attitude in real time as the aircraft is flying over terrain, which we have terrain maps inside the animation. So you get a very good understanding of the situational awareness of what's happening on the aircraft. You can see the instrumentation that the pilot sees. That's being fed in real time by data that's being streamed from the aircraft and driving those gauges. So you can see in real time what the pilot can see. On this particular trial, we had a cockpit area microphone installed in the flight deck. So we were also streaming cockpit audio so you could hear what was happening on the flight deck, making this what we call a virtual cockpit. And then finally, on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the, again, different aspects of the aircraft animation and instrumentation. And then you can see on the right-hand side, all of the data that's streamed from the flight data recorder. And you can drag in real time any one of those parameters on the right-hand side. With your mouse, you can drag it into the analysis window in the middle, and you can literally diagnose what's happening on the aircraft in real time while it's still flying. All of this is delayed by roughly 5 seconds, which is just the speed of light propagation delay of things happening on the aircraft with your ability to see them demonstrated on the uptime visualization. So this was a very successful demonstration. This capability is protected by our patents, and we think that this is the future of handling exceptions on board aircraft to meet this timely access to flight data recorder information in the future. So to summarize the product portion, the SATCOM that FLYHT provides, we compete in SATCOM, but we also have one of the best SATCOM solutions available, we think the best. That has made us the current supplier for Airbus through L3Harris. So for the A320, the A220, and the A330, when an operator orders one of those airframes and checks SATCOM, they get the AFIRS product delivered through L3Harris to satisfy that requirement. We had the very first technical standard order to meet the safety services voice and data inside of the same equipment. We have broad aftermarket capabilities. Our STC library, which is the supplemental type certificate, or the ability to install in the aftermarket in aircraft. We have the largest library available, over 100 STCs for installing our product, which covers all the Airbus, Boeing, Embraer, you name it, all of the typically used commercial aircraft, we're able to provide STCs to our customers for installation. Super high voice quality, which has allowed us to make sales and replace our competitors' equipment. And then on the SaaS side, using that same equipment, we can provide all of those data capabilities that I discussed earlier, which provides this real-time data aircraft. We have these patents for the triggered streaming of flight recorder data, which we think will add incredible value to flight in the future as that patent becomes required for this timely access for flight recorder data requirements. And we have a very broad service offering. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn the presentation over to Paul Gill, who's going to give you a demonstration of our AirMap product.
Okay, I'll be sharing my screen here. The aircraft situational display that you see here is a pretty lightweight aircraft situational display. I'm displaying flight numbers, completed flights, tail numbers, airports, in a beautiful, simple, lightweight interface like this. So we designed AirMap to be simple and just be something that is just looks good, that you can place it on the wall of your operating center or on the desktop of someone working at the OCC. There's many of these features can be turned on and off to make it even more simple. One feature right here is the ability to actually hide a lot of your controls to basically just display the beautiful maps. There's a lot of really cool maps that you can get nowadays with various map providers. This is a dark mode map. We also have a light map which provides a much brighter contrast, but a lot of the time the dark mode is kind of like the way to go for newer web design. So and a lot of the aircraft really seem to pop nicely with the dark background and the blue aircraft being the current flights. The current flights are displayed here as this one. Where it shows you the flight path as well as all the observations that have happened along the way. So the observations are noted here. You saw this, it's whenever there's some sort of observation that's acknowledged on the system, this actually flashes or glows a little bit. Not necessarily on this flight, but all flights. It records all the UIs up here, so when the aircraft is out, off the ground, on, in the gate, shows you the tail number, the airframe, the origin airport, and the destination airport. This one does not have destination airport because Malindo does not actually typically file flight plans. AirAsia files flight plans religiously, in which case it gives a lot of other functionality, and mostly that being alerts, so that if the aircraft does something that is not in accordance with the flight plan, it will provide alerting, which I will show at the end of this demo, because we aren't going to be experiencing any alerts most likely. So I'll just show a couple screenshots of how those alerts actually pop up. So back to observations, each and every orb you see on the line is an observation. You should be able to click on it, or you should be able to rotate back through to show the circle around the orb, and it will tell you what kind of observation it is. This one right now, right here, you can see is a wind observation. There's a weather observation, so it actually shows that there are 7 knots. It shows with the barb on the display, the air temperature, altitude, those typical things. Whereas if I go back one more, that is not a weather observation. That is just position information with fuel on board. So that's coming from the flight link on board, whereas this is coming from the TAMDAR that's installed on board. All Malindo aircraft have both of those devices on board. So that is talking to all the aircraft that are in flight. Completed, this is a historical view of the aircraft that that completed the flight, so you can view exactly what happened on that flight. And it's kind of the same sort of situation as the active flights, with the exception that it is a little bit gray. It is gray in color to indicate that it's in the past, and it actually shows right here. So it shows the timeline when it was actually active. So from 7 in the morning till 9 in the morning UTC time. Again, if you click on active aircraft, you can actually see the same sort of thing right here. Everything in the past. Going back, the time on the time bar can be toggled for different time periods, so 3 hours, and that actually, decreases the resolution of the time, and it gives you the ability to go back in time and view the display as if it were happening at that moment. We have functionality coming up on the ASD in a couple of versions from now, on 3.1 and 3 through 3.3, where this is actually going into the future. So you'll be able to see everything that's happening in the past, as well as in the future for forecasting where the flight is going to go, and some other parameters that are going to be feeding into the ASD. It also gives you on this side of the screen the ability to step through the flight, in which case it's almost like simulating or playing back the past, and you can set the resolution of how fast it goes through. All the observations spill in just as if you were actually experiencing the flight in real time. So at any point you can toggle now, and it goes back to now, and all the aircraft actually display in a bright blue to display that it is in now. And any of these time frames can be toggled. So these are the tail numbers, so you can search by tail numbers as well. It's another way of looking and loading up the core of what you're really looking for, which is the flights. So this one is pointing to this tail, the LBW, and it shows that this is the active flight for it. Way to get back to that is to click the tail. So it's just another way of accessing through this menu. Displays the tail numbers that are for Malindo, that are loaded into the database, that is loaded into the client, which is in the last 12 hours. And lastly is airports. Airports is just basically a full list of the number of airports that have been loaded into AirMa in the last 12 hours. So we have other customers that are showing up on other airports, but for the Malindo airports, you have the ability to click directly on the airport code, and you see that there's an outbound aircraft. So it shows you that aircraft right there. So it's yet another way to get to the flights that you're looking for. This is a pretty handy little service when you are when you are looking for grounded aircraft, whichever aircraft are on the ground. You can click on this to find that. If there was more aircraft flying, submitting data into the application, these would be much more impactful, showing lots of inbound and outbound aircraft. AirAsia itself operates out of Kuala Lumpur, and there's always tons of aircraft coming into and out of this hub, so this is a really good one with lots of on the list. Okay, so that is the core of the search. From there, you go into filtering. Right now, this user is actually filtered on Malindo aircraft, so these are the only flight numbers that are actually displayed. So you can search to display only certain flight numbers. You can say this flight, and that will be the only thing that's actually displayed on the moving map display. And the same thing goes for tail numbers. Let's say you only want to look at one aircraft. You can add that aircraft just right there. So everything else goes away. So it's just meant to minimize the visual on what you're looking at. So it's just generally a very clean, beautiful looking item. And airports, same sort of thing. You can filter so you can see only one airport and the inbound aircraft, outbound aircraft, and parked aircraft. And lastly, fleets. If you ever have a situation where you have multiple fleets, you can actually just display this, and you click one fleet or the other. This one, the user again is already on Malindo, so it just displays Malindo. No active alerts. This is meant to kind of break out all the alerts that may be happening at any given time. Usually there's not more than one or two at any given time, so this is usually pretty small, but often there's warnings, alerts, red for a major problem, yellow for a warning, and gray for just some sort of notification. The observations. Weather observations is this. You see all these weather barbs that are displayed from other observations that are experienced by aircraft. You can turn those on and off. So these ones are winds. If I were to turn this off, all the wind observations would be going away. Turn back on. Turn on any icing experience. Do we have any icing whatsoever? It looks like we do not have any icing that was experienced. And you can change the different levels, the different flight levels as well. You'll see if there was any sort of wind icing event, you'd see this picture with that icing event. But it has not been experienced. Turbulence, same sort of thing. This would show up. You can increase the sensitivity. If I increase the sensitivity here, you start to get these observations that show up right there. So if you wanted to click on it, it would dig in and show you that observation right here. So here's a turbulence event with a certain peak. Yeah. I wanted to mention a couple of the alerts that were able to be presented on the tool. One of the focuses of the tool is that it's not a disruptive tool. That's a beautiful tool. Very simple interface, meant to not be just a large amount of information that's overbearing the user. So we have previous screen captures of past events where a typical event would trigger. So here's a quick example of lateral deviation. So the user would see a notification, a color notification of the aircraft changing, and seeing exactly what happened on that alert. These are also provided over email as well. So another one, this one is a fuel on board. So you can set different thresholds on the aircraft so that at the moment you go below a certain fuel level, you get notifications that get sent down to the operational center to know exactly what's happening on the aircraft. Another one, a diversion alert. So if the aircraft diverts off of the original flight plan, as I explained in the video, this is an AirAsia flight, and they actually file a flight plan. So the moment you change off of that flight plan, there's certain alerts that are thrown and immerse the user in alerts rather than just a large amount of information. And also for communication losses, one important thing on maintaining that steady stream of communication is to know if you've lost that communication for whatever reason. So we have yellow alerts to display after 15 minutes, and then red alerts to display after 30 minutes. And this looks a little more busy, there's a lot more observations that are happening on this, similar to how Tom's slide looked with a different background. And there's also other notifications that can happen, such as routine maintenance that the user would see. That would be more of a gray alert. And here's another example of a diversion where there's obviously a holding pattern for this airport, and then they diverted to a different airport. So that is the extent of the demonstration.
Great, thanks, Paul. I'll be talking next about our COVID-19 response, and then get into a bit of our financial results. So we posted our 2019 financial results on our website on April 8th last week. And we were really excited about our results last year. We posted a record 21 million in revenue and top line, and we finished the year with EBITDA of positive $1 million. And so we were raring to go. We were just rocking right into 2020. And in mid-March, things started to look a bit different. And so what we've been doing with the COVID-19 situation right now is we've been really looking at our cash conservatively. So we've been, we're looking at our cash at least weekly, sometimes daily. And we've undertaken several things to preserve our liquidity through this period. No one is traveling in the company. We're all working from home to ensure that our employees stay as healthy as possible. We've postponed new hires. We're initiating several just various cost-cutting measures internally. Some of those were kind of an obvious answer, and others were just being really as cautious as we can be. We're also accessing or looking to access various governmental programs to help us through this period on both sides of the Canadian-US border. We have approximately 2/3 of our employees are based out of Canada, with almost the other third based out of the US. So there are various programs on both sides of the border that we're looking at accessing, and that some we've applied for, some we will apply for as soon as the applications become available online. We're just waiting for those to become available. Another thing we're doing as our customers are approaching us, and you know, a lot of our customers are in situations of distress, and so when they approach us for help and support to get them through this period, we're also on our part looking to our suppliers to help us out so that the risk is spread around, and our relationships with our suppliers are allowing that to happen. Additionally, a couple of weeks ago, we did announce that we've temporarily licensed our TAMDAR weather data on a complimentary basis around the world. With a decrease in the number of flights has really meant that meteorological agencies have a decrease in the amount of data that's available to them for forecasting, and we're helping them through this COVID period. We're licensing that data so that they can enhance their data set and continue to provide the level of forecast that we've been accustomed to. So looking at our capital market profile, we ended the year with a share price of $1.30, which has since fallen to 65 cents as the whole market has dropped. Our market cap is currently sitting at just over 17 million. Our high and our low we definitely experienced in the COVID period, and our high of $1.90 we experienced mid last year. Our capital market profile looks fairly similar to a lot of what people are experiencing on the TSX Venture and other markets at the moment. So just having a look at the last 5 years, our overall gross margins. Our gross margin varies depending on the mix of revenue. So the more hardware in the revenue mix, our hardware comes in at margins typically around 30%, whereas our SaaS revenues, typically we see about 70 to 80% margins, and our licensing revenues hover just under 90%. And so the higher percentage of our revenue that is SaaS and licensing means that our gross margins are going to increase. So what we saw last year was in the overall mix, a higher proportion of hardware. And looking at, as Tom discussed earlier, our SaaS revenues in 2018 were comprised 40% of our revenue, whereas last year they were closer to 50%. So that together with the increased licensing component is really returning that higher gross margin when you're looking at this year compared to 2018. So we're returning to margins that we had seen typically in the previous 3 years. In the chart on the right, you can see a picture of how our revenue has grown over the past 6 years. The 21 million that we returned in 2019 was the highest that we've seen in our history. And a portion of that was a result of the acquisition of Panasonic Weather Solutions in Q4 of 2018, but there was also organic growth that contributed to a portion of that. And now looking at a quarterly view of our revenue, Q2 really contributed greatly to our revenue success last year. And that was just a combination of a strong performance in all of our 4 revenue categories. As you can see, the blue bar shows the SaaS revenues, and you can see it growing throughout since the last 8 quarters really. But last year, even quarter by quarter, you can see the increases that we saw, and that's our recurring revenue generator. And so it's really going to contribute to our success long term. The chart on the right shows the dramatic increase in our SaaS on a quarterly basis. The dramatic increase was the addition of the Panasonic Weather Solutions contracts that we acquired in 2018. But you can see that you can still see continued growth as well through Q4 2019. This next slide shows a picture of how our revenue, expenses, and EBITDA have varied over the past 5 years. So you can see the gray, the light gray in our revenue has increased, as I showed you in the previous slides, but also that we've been holding the line on our expenses, and EBITDA has grown as well as a result of us being able to contain our costs while seeing that increase in revenue. This next slide shows a geographical distribution of our revenue. In 2018, China was about 23%. It's become less of a percentage as we have had greater overall revenues and added a lot of revenue in Asia. Our licensing came in at 15% last year. And again, our total from last year was a record-setting 21 million top line. We have, over our history, shipped 2,800 units with 27 million flights carrying our equipment, over 4 million hours of flying. So just because we're getting short on time, I'm going to skip across this growth drivers. Tom touched on pretty much all of these areas. This would just be a summary of what he had discussed. Looking at our investment highlights, as I discussed before, our SaaS recurring revenue is growing, and it was 40% of our revenue in 2018. It comprised over 50%, or just under, sorry, 50% of our revenue in 2019, and continues to grow on a quarter-over-quarter basis. That revenue is interesting because it does recur, and it also carries high gross margins of 70 to 85%. Our sales backlog is currently sitting at about 52 million, and we've been able to sustain that over time. So sales backlog being what we have contracted with our customers that has not yet been delivered. So we'll be delivering that in future years. Most of our customers sign on for 5-year contracts, so that 52 million, it will be delivered anytime over the next 5 years, the majority of it over the next 2.5. That number we've been able to sustain. So our backlog number over the past several years has ranged anywhere from the mid 52 million mark on up to about 59 at its height. And that backlog is growing as our sales team signs new contracts, and it shrinks as we deliver that on that backlog and turn it into revenue. Our hardware sales carry gross margins of 30%, and our highest margin line of business is our licensing arrangement at just under 90% margin. So all of these really poise us well for accelerated growth. Having a look at our leadership team, you met Tom earlier. He came to us from L3, where he led the effort to implement AFIRS through our Airbus relationship, through L3's relationship with Airbus, and from which we see licensing revenues on our income statement today. Tom came to us in 2015. Derek Graham, he's our CTO and provides leadership on the technical side. Mathieu Plamondon is our COO, and he came to us from one of our customers where he had implemented an AFIRS program. I started with FLYHT in 2008 as the controller and moved into the CFO role 2 years ago now. And the latest addition to our executive team is Derek Taylor, who has been with FLYHT for 17 years, so he's quite well versed in everything that is FLYHT, and he stepped up into the VP Sales and Marketing role last month. Looking at our board members, we've got 9. About half of them are Americans, half being Canadians. Bill Tempany was the former CEO at FLYHT until he recruited Tom to take over that position as Bill was looking to retire. He remains on as chairman of our board. Nina Johnson joined us early last year, and she provides an airline operations perspective. Jack Olcott was the former president of the NBAA. Mike Brown offers legal advice. Doug Marlin has a wealth of history in and brings knowledge of development of software. Mark Rosenker he is the former chairman of the NTSB in the US. Barry Eccleston comes to us. He was the president of Airbus Americas. Captain Mary McMillan, she just joined us. She's the latest addition, and she brings. She's an airline pilot. And Paul Takalo has been with the company almost since the beginning, and he's our audit chair. Our board brings a wealth of knowledge in a very diverse range of fields. And so with that ends the formal part of the presentation. Deb, are we moving into?
Yeah, I'm right here. Hi, didn't leave you hanging there, Alana. So thank you very much. So now we're going to move into some Q&A, and there is a lot of questions. So I am going to limit it to 15 minutes just because we only allotted an hour and 15 for this. So I will run through them as quickly as possible. If not, I will follow up with the questions at the end. Okay, so I'm going to start with, let's see. Here's one question about TAMDAR. So you seem to be trying to expand your presence in the weather market with TAMDAR products, specifically trying to accelerate AirAsia installs and the free service to the World Meteorological Organization. Has AirAsia taken you up on your offer to accelerate installs? If so, how is it going? There's other parts of the question, but actually this is a question that comes up quite a bit. Maybe you can just talk about installations in the current landscape, Tom.
Sure. So obviously there's various value propositions that help the company grow, but one of the challenges that we have, or impediments to growth, is installation. So right now, the majority of our products require that our equipment be installed on the aircraft to collect the data to provide our real-time services. I will say we're looking to augment our existing collection of services with services that may not require hardware augmentation, and that's something that I think you can look for FLYHT in the future. But currently, what has a lot of people excited about this unfortunate course of events is the fact that there's many aircraft on the ground, and since they're on the ground, there's an opportunity to get installations done, which typically are challenging because aircraft operators don't like to take the aircraft out of service to perform the installation. So we've spoken with several operators to identify this is a great opportunity to get the installations done. AirAsia is one of those operators that we've spoken with. We think that they agree and that they think it's a great opportunity to perform additional installations. They have units that need to be installed. It really comes down to, I don't want to talk in detail about any particular operators, but while operators have laid off or furloughed portions of their fleet operations crew, air pilots and air crew, they've also laid off, in some cases, some of their maintenance folks. And so they may have a reduced capability right now to do installs, and all of that is based on a particular operator's cash position and their strategy for getting through this scenario. So optimally, they will get the equipment installed. Practically, there's challenges both from a staffing and cash position. Or I mentioned in the conference call, in some countries, it's difficult for the employees to even get to work because of strict curfews and challenges that this COVID environment presents. So all that said, we're hopeful that there's installations occurring. I don't have blow-by-blow reports from operators. That's not the way that they will typically operate. They'll we'll find out in a couple months when they're bringing the aircraft back into service. They'll request the equipment to be turned on if it's new, and we'll gain a better appreciation for how much we were able to get installed at that time.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And then we have some follow-on questions about the WMO. I'm not going to stumble across that one again. So what progress have you made with them? Do you have any feedback from them? And are you working on any other weather-related projects? And also, I'm just going to take a second and say it's really great what you're doing with the data during this time.
Yeah, thanks. WMO is the World Meteorological Organization. So it's the collection, it's the world body to help coordinate the activities of meteorological agencies around the world.
You had to show me up there, huh?
Just trying to make sure that everybody's on board. These are all, terms that I've learned in the last year too, because we didn't really do weather until our acquisition. But it's been a really positive activity, this opening up of TAMDAR data. Of course, we got approval from the National Mesomet Program and NOAA before we did that, since they're our paying customers. But with the significant drop off in the number of airborne observations, we were requested to provide TAMDAR data. About 65, I think as of the end of March, about 65% of the observations that were typically used in numerical weather prediction were missing because the number of worldwide flights were down so far. So the technologies that collect airborne observations, there's really three types. There's TAMDAR, which is technology that's owned, and the data set is owned by FLYHT. There's AMDAR, which is using the instrumentation on board an aircraft to collect wind speed, temperature, pressure sometimes. Doesn't include valuable information like humidity, relative humidity, because there's not typically aircraft sensors that measure that. But that other information is valuable and it is collected. And then there's a third technology, which is a weather vapor sensor system. It's a competing technology that is installed in about 150 aircraft around the world, and it collects just the relative humidity. So when you put that together with the AMDAR data, you can get data similar to TAMDAR, but it's just acquired through a slightly different means. So all of those together represent the opportunity to collect weather observations from airborne observations. And as I mentioned in the conference call, the impact to the worldwide numerical forecasting is about, if you take away all of those weather airborne observations, it impacts the winds aloft measurements at the jet stream level at about 15%, and it impacts the measurements at ground level by about 3% in the worldwide numerical prediction models. So that's not a small impact, and obviously the better weather predictions that we have, the safer the world is, because a lot of different industries rely on weather prediction in keeping their employees and other people safe. So this is what motivated FLYHT to make our observations free during this COVID-19 period. The upside is that all these WMO organizations have learned how to integrate TAMDAR into their operations. So hopefully in the future, that can create opportunities for FLYHT if they find the observations that we're currently providing beneficial.
Thank you, Tom. So I have a question about liquidity. So can you expand on liquidity for FLYHT, assuming a second quarter of curtailed operations, separate from the backlog that you described at the beginning? Maybe you can just take us through your cash.
Sure. So I mean, FLYHT FLYHT has always been a marginally capitalized company. No surprise there. We periodically have had to raise money to fund the further development of the different products that we sell. Fortunately, the raise that we conducted finished in November of last year was timely, and so we entered the year well capitalized. Obviously, as I've made clear in the CEO letter as part of the fourth quarter results, and on the conference call, we talked about some of the revenue streams in the company, namely some licensing and the weather data, as well as a good fraction of our airborne SaaS customers are still using our services, are still paying. In some cases, they've reduced the number of aircraft, and in some cases, they've become late in their payments, and we're working with them to, try to come to a mutually agreeable scenario that allows them to, we want to support them because we know it's a difficult time. Of course, that puts a burden on our finances. So as a result, in order to shore up our liquidity, which is not an issue right now, but we're just looking down the road and trying to make sure that we remain viable, we're pursuing government grants and loans in both the United States and Canada that we feel apply. In the United States, we have our wholly owned subsidiary FLYHT Inc. that is making those overtures to acquire that capital. And within Canada, of course, it's our core entity, FLYHT Aerospace Solutions Ltd, that is going to be making those efforts. So we think that there is a meaningful amount of money that can be gained through those sources, and that will help us if we see diminished revenues like we expect in the second and possibly third quarter.
Thank you. So I know you answered some of these questions in the chat, Tom, but there's one that I think is worth addressing just for anyone that's listening in. So the L3 Harris announcement of $2.4 million US announced earlier this year. Have you received any part of the license fee yet? And can you give us an update on where that stands?
Yeah, we have. We have shipped a significant portion of that order, and we have received payment on some of it, and some of it is forthcoming. So you'll see that represented in our future financial statements.
Okay. And then I'm just going through these. Sorry, there's a lot of questions. I had a question emailed to me actually that I think it comes up quite a bit, and it's just talking about STCs and defining what that is, like what constitutes a new plane, and can you explain that a little bit in more detail?
Sure. Supplemental type certificate is, that's what STC stands for. When an airframer builds an aircraft, they have to get that aircraft certified by governing bodies such as the FAA or Transport Canada. That designation is called a TC, a type certificate. So that's how airframer gets the aircraft approved for sale and for utilization. In the aftermarket, there has to be a means of installing equipment on that aircraft, and so that's where the supplemental type certificate comes from. Supplemental meaning after the aircraft has already been TC'd or type certified. So there's a process whereby you submit a data package that shows the configuration changes and equipment that you want to get approval to install on an aircraft. There's various tests that need to be conducted as part of the STC to ensure that it's safe and to ensure that the equipment and the changes that you're making to the aircraft don't impair other systems or cause problems with the design of the aircraft. So once you get all those hurdles, you ultimately get issued an STC. The STC is the authorization that allows you to install equipment like AFIRS and TAMDAR into an aircraft. So when we sell our solution to airlines and lessors in the aftermarket, we sell it with an STC. That STC is essentially the authorization and the instructions that our customers use to install our equipment in the aircraft so they can use it.
Gotcha. Okay, so a follow-on question to that is, so if an OEM changes engines on an aircraft model and a new STC is issued, is this considered a new plane, or does it have to be a completely new build? And I guess they just want like further definition and an example if you can.
Yep. So the question I think is driving at what constitutes a new type of aircraft, and that's really determined between the airframer and the legislative body, the FAA or the Transport Canada. New engineering can and typically is a new type, requires a new type certificate for an aircraft. So I'm not going to pretend to know all of the rules that are associated with what constitutes a new type or what doesn't. But generally speaking, a significant change in the avionics or engines will create the requirement for a new type certificate.
Okay. There's also some questions relating to China and people just wanting a general update. I know you've covered it, but maybe you could just speak to what you wrote in the chat as well as give whatever information you can.
Yeah, sure. So what we're seeing, like I said in the conference call, China's kind of coming back to life. We saw them reach, on our system, we monitor flights. We saw them reach a low. We see them coming out of that low and going back into operations. One interesting thing that I did note is that the cargo operations in China and elsewhere in the world are actually as busy or busier than they've ever been. So it's impacting different aspects of commercial aviation differently. The passenger carrying component of airlines is been really negatively impacted. Flights are down. You saw the recent report by, it wasn't ICAO, it was IATA, that they thought that there would be a 55% reduction in revenues this year for passenger carrying aircraft. And so that's a pretty dramatic impact overall to the industry. But in China, they were impacted first by this virus. They're kind of coming out of it ahead of the rest of the world. We're beginning to see activities. We do have several different opportunities there that we're pursuing. Some are in our traditional line of AFIRS aircraft installations and opportunities. And then there's a whole nother class of opportunities associated with TAMDAR and weather that we're working with the Chinese Met agencies and the Chinese government. And there's an opportunity in some of these that we could work with third parties and deploy a large component of the aircraft there with TAMDAR and help to set up weather collection to help the Chinese with their numerical weather predictions. So we remain bullish about the opportunities with China right now. Obviously, things have slowed down in this interim period, but we expect long-term for there to remain great opportunities for FLYHT, and we're well positioned there.
Thanks. And I apologize if you just answered this. I've been scanning through 3 different email accounts and consolidating questions, but I had one more question, or actually 2 more questions about China. so we can stay thematically. And again, I apologize if you said this. Can you give an update on how many AFIRS SaaS boxes have been turned back on in China? And then is there another part of the world that started to pick back up after the slowdown?
I honestly don't know that number in China. We didn't really turn units off there per se. There was just a reduced usage by the customers. Technically, our contracts there are to provide services by aircraft by month, and so unless they actually remove the aircraft from services, our contracts allowed us to continue to collect revenues. But we're being very careful and working, like I said, very closely with our airline customers, and there are specific requirements that each one has in the ways of assistance. So I don't know the answer to that question. In terms of where else things are picking up, Asia Pacific is still really quite reduced in traffic, as is Europe. So we're really seeing China start to come back alive, and they're really the first. We're waiting for that wave to move out of China.
I had one more question from email. Can you shed some light on the new software that you're working on? How many applications or products will this mean for FLYHT? And can you give a timeline on when these new services will be available?
Well, I think what we'll do is probably hold off and launch some of those properly. We're working on several different we're always working on improving the products that we have, and that work is consistent. But we are working on some specifically new capabilities, applications, and platforms. And rather than, and they will enable higher speed access to the aircraft. It will enable some new and interesting capabilities. One of which we talked about was we put out a press release about an opportunity to jointly develop a product with a company called Case Bank. So that's an example of the type of product that we're working on. But rather than dribble out information, we would rather launch them properly, and so we'll do that at the appropriate time.
Okay, and I think I just have one final question here. So you did answer it in the chat, but I think it's worth bringing up on the call. So your SaaS products are focused on the Iridium network. Do you have plans to expand into other satellite networks? And then you say you have streaming black box capability. Have you seen interest from customers in this capability? If so, where are you in terms of the sales cycle?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So on the first question, our current product offering operates on the Iridium network. It'll operate on other networks as well, like we did with Boeing on the Eco Demonstrator, but we do that by connecting our AFIRS unit to other satellite proxies over a TCP/IP link or an Ethernet link. So that's how we accomplish that in the Boeing example. And that would be, we have different opportunities to do that as well with various customers. We are, however, working on the next generation of product, and that will increase the bandwidth going from block 1 to block 2 in Iridium, increase the bandwidth by about a factor of 200. So it'll be a dramatically faster solution that we will be fielding in the future. In terms of data streaming, there is interest in the product offering that we have and the intellectual property that we've developed. Those discussions are preliminary, I would say, at this point.
And I think that's everything that I have for questions. I apologize if I've missed anyone. Please feel free to reach out. I did do a poll today, if anyone's interested in the responses. So we posed a few questions to the attendees and the panelists as well, including how long until you think you will use air travel for a business trip. We gave a few different options: 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and a year. And 22% of the people on this or in this webinar said 3 months, and 78% said 6. And then we posed the same question, but for vacation, and 89% said 6 months, and 10% said 1 year. Oh, now we've got some late voters. Trying to skew my stats. And then we also asked, should the Canadian government come up with a bailout package for the airlines, similar to what we've seen in the US? And 90% said yes, and 10% said no. And we got about 55% of the votes, or people voted, so just some interesting stuff. Anyway, I want to thank the management team for taking the time to present today. As always, it's been a pleasure, and thanks to the attendees. In the next couple days, you will receive a follow-up email with a replay of the webinar, which will also be available on our website and perhaps on FLYHT as well if management would like it posted, and a quick survey. So thank you everyone for participating, and I hope you have a good afternoon. Stay safe.